Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our seventh EUDR webinar. It feels quite recent that we started with the first one, so I'm very excited to start off today with the session on EUDR during the postponement, how to prepare. So I think, as all of you know at this point that are attending today, there is a lot of talk around the EUDR, and most of that talk is based on hearsay and uncertain rumors, so to say. So what we're doing today is kind of to bring it all together, so what we know, what we don't know, to give you kind of a good basis that you can work on, and then follow up with the approach that we recommend taking today. And of course, understanding also that every company has a different context in which they operate. So we have several scenarios, several context bases that we can share with you. And then, of course, during the end, we'll go through the Q&A. So please put all of your questions in the bottom right in the question section, and then we will make sure to answer most of those, if not all, during the end. Also, just quickly launching my message in the chat to reiterate that. For those that don't know us, my name is Jasper. I'm one of the sustainability researchers here at CoolSet, and together with Elisabeth, also a sustainability researcher, we've been working on EUDR now for the better part of half a year. Elisabeth even longer, and we've been kind of putting it together in terms of the software solution that we've provided, but also, of course, in terms of communicating that to our customers, making it clear to everyone. And we've been doing that for half a year, but also now in the last couple of days, in the last couple of weeks, we've been following everything as it comes in. So we want to share that with you today. So we want to share with you the recent news, we want to share with you kind of the scenarios that we expect going forward, and we want to share with you the strategies that you can apply. A quick overview of the plan for today. So we're going to start with a recap of kind of the last couple of weeks regarding the news around EUDR. Then we're going to go over the expected scenarios. What can you expect going forward? We've identified 3. Then Elisabeth will talk about the variable versus fundamental elements of EUDR. So kind of what is set in stone and what can change potentially. Then we'll talk about what to prepare in practice, strategies to consider, and of course, next steps. And as always, we will end with the Q&A so that we have enough time to answer the questions that might not be answered during today's session. So let's begin with a bit of a recap of the EUDR news. So to start with, what happened in the last 4 or so months. So we know that in May 2025, 11 states pushed back on EUDR, and we're seeing that this is part of kind of the beginning of the conversation. And of course, this is more than 4 months ago. So we're actually decided halfway when I was building the slide to provide more context. But in May, it started with 11 states pushing back and saying they wanted a no-risk category. Then in July 2025, 18 EU agricultural ministers spoke out, and they complained that full traceability was extremely difficult, if not impossible, and asked to drop requirements for low-risk countries, as national controls should be enough. Then, as we all know, I think at this point in September, Jessica Roswell, the EU Commissioner for the Environment, requested a clean 1-year delay due to IT issues with EU Traces, which is the due diligence statement reporting platform. And with clean here, I mean that a clean delay means no other kind of amendments or simplifications. It means just a 1-year delay, after which the EUDR will be picked up again as it stands today. And then that brings us to October 2025, which brings us to the webinar today, where we're seeing a lot of mixed reactions. So we also know that the Vice President of the European Commission, Teresa Ribera, is speaking out against a delay, along with senior members of the European Parliament. And as of today, the 15th of October, uncertainty remains, which we'll dive into deeper now. So what's new? Of course, Elisabeth and I have spent the last weeks kind of sifting through the internet, speaking to partners, looking into kind of the details on what might change. And we've come across a couple of things. One of them being a statement from the German Agricultural Minister, Alois Rainer. And he stated, after the delay letter was announced, I have repeatedly advocated to the European Commission for the introduction of a zero-risk option in the EUDR. The Commission hesitated for a long time, and now time has run out. The only solution was to postpone the regulation. Now, why I'm highlighting this quote and not, many of the other quotes is for several reasons, and I found this really interesting to find. For me, it tells us three things. So on the one hand, kind of the big bombshell here is that it was never about a buggy IT system. He doesn't mention that anywhere. He basically says, well, I wanted this no risk category along with all the other agricultural ministers. So behind closed doors, we had conversations, and the only solution was to postpone another year so that we can get this through. That highlights that the delay was in fact about this about kind of the simplifications that they wanted to discuss, but also, of course, due to lobby pressures, as also the Green Party in the European Parliament mentioned, that this is due to lobby pressure and not due to any IT system whatsoever. It also tells us that the delay is going to be an enabler of further simplifications if it's up to him. And of course, it also says that the EUDR will go into effect next year, so that we're not expecting any cancellations whatsoever. We didn't expect this to begin with, but of course, seeing kind of the turbulent climate in the European Commission, the European Parliament, anything can happen at this point. But it's good to see at least that there is kind of a base understanding that, okay, we're talking about simplifications, we're talking about delays, we're not sure about what's going to happen and in what form it will happen, but nobody's talking about any sort of cancellation. On the other hand, 17 companies have written a letter to Mrs. Roswell asking for the EUDR not to be delayed, including chocolate magnates Nestle, Ferrero, Mars, and Tony's Chocolonely. I'm sure you will all know some of them, if not all of these magnates, and it goes to show that the EUDR has a lot of kind of has caused a lot of people to get involved in the conversation. So what they write is that this approach would introduce considerable uncertainty and stakeholder disengagement and result in additional compliance expenses for businesses, contrary to the intended simplification. So this is really interesting here, because what essentially is happening is that the European Commission is so to say operating in the interests of the businesses, but that the businesses themselves, these massive businesses that operate in the cacao industry and thus have to do a lot of EUDR work, are saying, actually, don't delay it, don't simplify it, go forward, because while you think you're helping us, you're actually adding additional compliance costs, and you're disengaging the stakeholder engagement processes that have already been set up, because 3 months before the start date, all these companies had already set up all the processes. We've also seen that here at CoolSet. A lot of the companies that we've been talking to had already started setting up all the relevant processes, because starting 3 months in advance is already quite late. And now to come with kind of a delay announcement is a bit of a slap in the face to these companies. What else is new? Unfortunately, not much. So the delay proposal is still not drafted by the European Commission. Also, Brussels is keeping quiet, something that we've seen frequently this year, also with the first omnibus proposal on CSRD and CSDD, for example. We've seen that in these discussions, the Commission, the Parliament have been very quiet about what comes out and what doesn't, which has been a big frustration for companies that ultimately are required to report on this. And also here again, we've seen that, well, not only did they wait until 3 months before the starting date to come with a letter, but now we're 2 weeks further at least, and the Commission still hasn't taken an official stance. So if they want to make sure that before the end of the year, the Commission comes out with a proposal, that the Parliament discusses that proposal and sends it forward to the Council, for the Council then to agree, and to have, for all those institutions to potentially also have trilogue discussions, for all of that to happen before the end of the year is going to be very tight. And even if it does happen before the end of the year, it's going to be very frustrating, because we don't know what's going to happen until the moment that it's declared official. Also interesting here, doesn't directly relate to EUDR, but gives a bit of an indication of the political climate right now in Brussels. Last week, there were 2 votes of no confidence against European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Although she did survive both, it does indicate that this is quite a hard time for her. And interestingly enough, the votes of no confidence came from both sides of the political spectrum. So on the one hand, the far-right motion criticized her climate, migration, and economic policies, including her recent deal with the US, and accused her of lack of transparency as well as censorship. So that's why they handed in the motion of no confidence. And then the left, on the other hand, also handed in a motion of no confidence. And they said she's not doing enough to address the humanitarian suffering in Gaza, and also criticized the Commission's trade deal with the US. So what we're seeing is that from both sides, she's under fire. And right now, she still has a majority to keep her in power, also because she's from the EPP, which is the biggest party in Brussels. And of course, that party alone won't help her stay alive in the Commission. But it does indicate that her power is right now under pressure. So what we're seeing as the main expected scenarios going forward. As mentioned, we've identified 3 scenarios that we're seeing. So the first one is the no delay scenario. And why are we seeing that as a realistic scenario is because a group of well-positioned pro-EU members of the European Parliament proposed 3 key steps to avoid delay. Before going into those 3 key steps, I want to quickly introduce those members of the European Parliament to give you a bit of an idea. So on the left, we have Pascal Canfin. Some of you might have seen him around because he's quite visible on LinkedIn and kind of in the debates around this topic. So he's from the Renew Group and is a French national. The right of him, we have Jonas Sjöstedt, who's from Sweden. So hopefully I didn't butcher the name, but he's from the left. Then on the right of him, we have Marie Toussaint, who's from the Greens and is a French national. And then on the far right, although he's from the left, is Timo Wölken, who is from the Socialists and the Democrats and is a German national. So together, these 4 have signed this letter to the European Commission in which they have taken a stance and mentioned these 3 points. And the 3 points are mainly related to the EU Traces system, so the IT system, the IT problems that are being addressed. And while I think they also understand that the IT system probably is not the core issue, they want to make it very hard for the commissioner to still argue that the delay is required because of the IT system, and rather force her to show her hand. To say, well, it's not the IT system actually. It is just the fact that the lobbyists have pressured us. Although of course they will never say the lobbyists, but they'll say, well, we want to delay because the businesses have indicated that they want to change the way that EUDR is being rolled out. Even though, as we've just shown, some of the major businesses don't want this delay to happen. So first point is that they say that the Commission should allocate sufficient technical and financial resources to make the EUDR information system fully operational by year end. This seems like an obvious argument, especially considering that the EUDR has already been delayed by 1 year back in 2024. And of course, then already wasn't new. So first was introduced in 2023. So the Commission has had 2 years to make this system fully operational. Also, some IT experts have already mentioned that there's no way that this is the issue. It's in the scale of, I think, around 100 terabytes of information that they have to process every year. That is for a kind of institution such as the European Commission, that is nothing. So they should be able to manage this. And even if it is true that the system isn't ready, they should spend a lot of the financial resources that they have, and they have a lot, on making it feasible. Point 2 that they raise, that even if the IT system is not fully ready, it should prepare contingency measures so companies and authorities can meet their EUDR activities or duties, even if the IT problems persist. We've also seen that now in the Netherlands, for example, where we've had conversations with some of the regulators, and they've said, well, we're also willing to start without, for example, enforcing EUDR in terms of the audits, but we want companies to go into their supply chain because that already itself is going to take quite a while. Third point they raise, the Commission should issue updated guidelines to clarify responsibilities during system outages and give practical advice to prevent traces crashes. So they're giving a really practical roadmap to say, well, okay, first of all, you shouldn't allow kind of a IT failure at this stage. So try to do everything that you can to fix it. But then they say, if that persists, delay should not be the only option on the table, because that just creates so much disruptions in the process, in the political process, but also for the businesses themselves. And we need that time now to prepare companies for setting up their supply chains, because that is easier said than done. So they make it really hard for Commissioner Roswell and further down the line, the other parties to argue that the IT system is the issue at hand. Then another point to raise here about why this option is being considered. As I mentioned, the Vice President of the European Commission, Teresa Ribera, warns, don't open EUDR. She acknowledges the IT issues, but wants fixes without weakening the law. but is also seen as a green voice in a right-leaning commission. So although the European Commission isn't officially politically colored, there is, of course, always an association of certain party members to certain parties, such as, for example, Jessica Roswell, having worked for the EPP in the past. She doesn't belong to EPP now, but of course, it does indicate that she is aligned with their interests. Mrs. Ribera also mentioned that it is better to ensure goals are achieved than just simplify. Now, that brings us to our second scenario, which is a one-year delay with no further changes. Why have we considered this? Because that is what Commissioner Roswell's letter asked for, and this is kind of the main source that we have now that's actually from the Commission itself that we're expecting going forward. She represents the European Commission and writes, the Commission is considering a postponement. And also what is good to note here is that the EU Commission drafts all EU regulations and wouldn't do this without serious support being expressed behind closed doors. Also good to know here is that this has already happened last year. So there was a clean delay without further simplifications. So yeah, we're seeing this based on kind of the idea that history might repeat itself. This could also happen again this year. And that brings us to the third scenario, which is a one-year delay and a no-risk category being applied. So why could this happen? So as we already saw, German Agricultural Minister Alois Rainer spoke clearly in favor of this option. Also, the EPP wrote after Roswell's letter came out, a key step in a necessary revision of the deforestation regulation is the introduction of a zero-risk category. Good to note here is that the EPP is the biggest party in the European Parliament. And also here, zero risk is the same as no risk. So they're being used interchangeably. And of course, as I mentioned, also in July, 18 out of 27 agricultural ministers called for simplification of EUDR. And this includes Austria, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Finland, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Sweden. And interestingly enough, back then, for example, Germany and France, which are kind of the big powerhouses of the European Union, didn't co-sign the letter. But now, of course, we're seeing Alois Rainer, the German agricultural minister, being a proponent of this as well. And we also know that France hasn't been the biggest supporter of sustainability regulations in the last couple of years, calling for example, very high scopes for CSDDD. So we know that they will probably also ultimately support this drive by these agricultural ministers. Now, I want to quickly ask you, before we go into our details, what do you expect most likely? Do you consider no delay, a clean delay, or delay with simplifications likely? So let's see at the answers coming in. So 61% of you are saying that a delay with simplifications is most likely. 29% are saying that a clean delay is likely, and 10% of you are saying that no delay is likely. Yeah, I think I agree with the general sentiment. I think all options are feasible, so I'm happy to see that there is a bit of a range as well. But I agree that scenario 3 is currently looking likely within the political climate and of what we've seen. And that also brings me to my next slide, which is what we think is most likely to happen. Yeah, as you also mentioned, or the majority of you have mentioned, scenario 3 is the most likely candidate, as most agricultural ministers speak in favor of a no-risk category. The EPP backs it too and has a political majority, albeit with the far right. So this is, again, an argument why it shouldn't necessarily happen, because this could also be a reason for it to be blocked. As we saw with the Omnibus 1 proposal, a pro-EU majority was chosen by the EPP, which could also be the case now, but it's too early to tell. And a note here is that a no-risk category might not be compatible with World Trade Organization regulations, as it could violate key non-discrimination provisions of the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. This was researched by a law firm who specifically looked into the feasibility of a zero-risk category for EUDR, and they identified that, well, if this applies only to EU member states, for example, this will not be allowed under WTO rules. So what could come next? For now, it's not even a proposal yet. So it's just a letter from Commissioner Roswell. We're hoping that very soon now we'll expect more from the Commission on either saying, yes, a delay might be proposed, or no, we're not going to delay. Either way, it's good to get an update soon. But the law remains unchanged until the Commission drafts a delay proposal. the European Parliament votes and amends, the European Council votes and accepts, and then the publication in the official journal of the European Union, which is more of a formality but needs to happen for it to become official. Last year, this only took 2.5 months. So it could go fast this year, but also last year we had a clean delay. So now if the Commission proposes a clean delay and then the European Parliament, some parties say, well, no, we want amendments, that might make the discussion a bit more complicated. So what could come next? I think the European Commission will come forward with a proposal soon. Parliament will get it through with a narrow conservative EPP-led majority. And here simplification amendments are likely, but it could also be part of a separate proposal. So we have yet to see how that plays out. Also with CSRD, for example, we saw that there was a stop the clock directive that was rolled out very quickly so that companies had certainty about the delay. And then in a separate proposal, they talked about the changing of the scope and several simplification measures. So that could also be the case here. And then ultimately the Council will approve with amendments being possible, although last year the Parliament already pushed for amendments and then the Council rejected those amendments and required a clean delay. So they could still request certain changes being made. And that brings me to the next part, which will be discussed by Elisabeth, where we talk about, okay, if a delay happens, what can we expect to remain and what can we expect to change?
Nice. Thank you very much, Jasper. Yeah, so indeed, considering all this uncertainty, we have taken the time to split between some variable elements of EUDR versus some fundamental ones that we think will stay there regardless of any changes. So starting on with the variable ones, of course, we know the benchmarking has already been rejected even before the official discussions about any postponement. So that is one of the very variable elements right now because it influences what are your responsibilities going to be as a company. As a second element, of course, we have the responsibilities of low-risk category orders. Right now, what we know for low-risk category is that they benefit from a simplified due diligence. However, if the no-risk category gets introduced indeed, we expect that the countries that currently sit on the low-risk category most probably will be the ones that will be moved on the no-risk category. So if you are part of this, you still have a lot of uncertainty on what your responsibilities will be at the end. The third element that we think it doesn't worth a lot of your time spending time on is preparing on order level. Right now, we know that the baseline of due diligence statement submission is on order level. However, with the postponement and with the further simplifications, working on order level due diligence most probably will lead to incomplete preparations, and instead you can do something on entities that remain unchanged, like suppliers or origins, for example, that we will see later on. And lastly, even though it's mandatory later on for the companies to submit these due diligence statements, we really think that the due diligence submission process internally is not something that it's worth your time at this point because of all the discussions with the lack of IT system, but also with the postponement. There are a lot of things that you can do before going forward with the DDS submission process. Now, on the other side, we have some fundamental elements on EUDR that, here we are. So starting on with the EUDR knowledge, even if there are some simplifications or changes happening, knowing the core of the regulation is something that will really help you understand your responsibilities even when changes come. And we also need to mention that by understanding the core of the regulation, you can also understand better what are these changes and how the changes that are being proposed will influence your contribution as a company. Then regardless of any changes that happen, suppliers will always be at the core of stakeholder engagement and data collection. So we really think that keeping up with supplier engagement is something that will for sure pay off in the future. Then for the last two elements, origins and risk assessments and mitigation, both of these elements are literally the core of what EUDR requires companies to do. So considering that EUDR is a law already enforced since 2023, we see not a lot of room to change the core foundations of the regulation. So especially if you're importing, you should expect still to see requirements like collecting origins and assessing risks and mitigating risks. One thing that we would like to mention throughout the whole webinar today is that all of this information could be used with the rest of your business in order to amplify other areas of compliance potentially, or understanding your overall business risks. Now, we would like to deep dive into 4 different areas on how you can prepare now. And if you, in the next slide, you're going to see what are these things. So we have chosen 4 different exercises that we think you can prepare now. The first is supplier collaboration and running some general supplier assessments. The second is building traceability for your value chain. The third one is already going forward with geolocation collection and data on that level, on geolocation level. And for the brave ones, already starting with assessing the risks and creating a process. We're going to start with the first one, which is the supplier engagement and assessment. We propose as a first step to involve all your suppliers on some sort of training and information providence on EUDR. You can do this either through courses or with guides, whatever works best for your supplier relationships, but we do think that you need to mention the fundamentals of EUDR, which will not change, your responsibilities and their responsibilities, and how these two connect with each other. Give them a set of data that you're going to need them to collect for you and how to collect them. And lastly, introduce the idea of risk and mitigation together. As a second step, after you have set the baseline of EUDR, we propose that you start some assessments on suppliers as an entity, so the supplier as a company, regardless of orders or origins or any other elements of EUDR. This is because for non-EU suppliers, later on you will have to assess the value chain risks, which is part of the Article 10 requirements of EUDR. And for the EU suppliers, we're going to have to assess their readiness so that you can choose if you can trust them or not later on. The goal of this is that by doing this, you have created a set of non-changing data points that you can then link to every order that you want when you go to order level compliance. Now, in the next 2 slides, we're going to check what are the exact data points that we propose that you ask from them. For EU suppliers, we said that the goal is to understand if we can trust the supplier or not to receive the due diligence statement references. This means collecting data about their preparations as an organization. Have they appointed someone responsible for EUDR? Are they training the employees and more? Then the same for their suppliers. How are they involving and preparing their suppliers? And then as a third step, you should ask them questions about how they are forming their EUDR processes. What data are they collecting? How do they collect them? What risks are they assessing? How do they do mitigations? And last but not least, also check if there are any non-compliance instances of your suppliers. All these data points will directly relate to the relevant risks that will make you make a decision on if you can trust your supplier or not for due diligence statements references. Now, if your suppliers are non-EU, as we said, you need to collect data in order to assess risks on value chain level. This includes supply chain complexity information, like how many steps are there between you and the producer, how many countries are involved. Then the second step is asking questions about how is there any mixing happening in the chain? Is there any heavy processing happening that you were not aware before? Are your suppliers having any traceability systems and safeguards in place so that they can truthfully give you the information about where the materials are coming from? And lastly, you need to ask them questions about any circumvention instances, like if they're using any transit hubs, any re-export countries, and more. Again, these data points are relating directly to the risks that are mentioned in Article 10 that you need to run for every supplier on every order. Now, the second exercise after you have finished with suppliers is traceability. Traceability means the exercise where you start tracking every product to its raw materials through every stage of the supply chain. We choose traceability as the second exercise after suppliers because it's already a mainstream tool that is used across different industries And usually it's used to drive different efficiencies, or it's used as a sustainability tool. So it's not an EUDR specific tool. Now, even though EUDR will indeed ask you to do traceability of all your orders to origins, I would like today to spend some time on how it can be useful in other areas of your business so that you understand why it's worth your time at this point. Business-wise, traceability is used as a tool for risk management, for example, to identify early on unreliable or illegal suppliers. It is also used in order to ensure supply security, because by doing this traceability exercise, you can identify any sourcing dependencies that will drive your sourcing decisions and procurement decisions better. ESG-wise, traceability is also used as a tool to build trust with investors or customers, because you create open, transparent reporting on where you source your materials from, or it could also be used to prove any sustainability claims you're making, like ethical sourcing, for example. Now, the third step and exercise we said is that, if you are borderline no risk category, maybe this step can be skipped. But if you are importing from a country that currently is standard risk country of origin, then it really worth your time to start collecting the geolocation data. This exercise includes two actions. Firstly, asking your suppliers and providing them some sort of interface for them to map their plots of land, like their farms, on the map. And after you get this information on that level of entity, you can start asking them to collect data for this particular farm that they plotted on the map. The data that you have to collect are the baseline data that we have discussed for sure in other webinars as well, but maybe for reference, I will point them out, which is evidence of deforestation-free land, evidence of legal production, like do they comply with the laws, how are they treating, or are there any indigenous people or rights infringements in the area? How do they treat their workers? Are there any labor rights infringements happening? Then information about their business practices to identify any unethical business practices, and an overall country trustworthiness for the country of origin. Again, similarly to the suppliers, this contributes directly to some EUDR risks, but where I want to spend most of the time on is on the business as usual risks. So we can see here that every single category of data points can contribute to a mainstream risk that companies would assess if they were interested in picking up a risk management framework. For example, let's do indigenous rights. So by collecting information and assessing the risk of indigenous rights being infringed, you also can check if there is any association with human rights scandals in your chain. Of course, this could lead to a lot of reputational risk if it gets revealed that you're sourcing from somewhere that people are not being treated properly, or they're trespassing customary lands. Now, moving on to the next. Last but not least, it's mitigation. And since you have gone through the trouble of collecting all the data on supplier level and on origin level, why not move forward and create the process to assess the risks on the data that you have already collected? And this way, you're going to already get a summary of the risks that are there, and along with a lot of time for you to prepare your mitigations and work with your suppliers together, because you need to anticipate that it will take much longer than what you expect. Now, let's take a step back and see this with a more of a high-level lens. And considering all these practical steps, let's see what are the strategies that you can consider moving forward with the postponement. The first one strategy that we acknowledge is keeping momentum by building the core. By freezing right now, you already are on the losing side, because you're going to waste the resources that are already spent. And we also saw that freezing last year also led to a lot of last-minute handling, where companies found themselves this October being again unprepared. Instead, you can use this delay in order to establish the core foundations that we just talked. And the key deliverable out of this would be that by operationalizing the core now, you start 2026 already compliant, or if not EUDR compliant, at least you know you're working with a clean supply chain that doesn't cause any issues. Now, the second strategy is to invest in reusable building blocks. We talked through the previous slides on how supplier engagement, traceability, and risk assessment are things that can be used in other areas of your business, so that if something goes terribly wrong with EUDR, you have something that can be reused in other areas of your company. I have here the example of how EUDR risk indicators can be used as part of mainstream enterprise risk management or your sustainability goals and plans if you have any as a company. Here, I would like to just forward one example, which is if you search your origins for deforestation and you realize that deforestation exposure is indeed something that is happening in your chain, you have actually identified that you have a very high resource scarcity risk, because when you're purchasing only from deforested areas, in the very, very near future, you're not going to have any resources to purchase from. So this gives you information about how your procurement will evolve in the future. The key deliverable in general out of this strategy is that you invest in systems that serve both EUDR and wider operational or ESG goals. And this way you create a proactive process that can be reused in other areas. Now, the last strategy that we propose is that instead of stopping with supplier engagement, accelerate supplier engagement instead. Imagine how frustrating and difficult it is for us to cope with all the changes. I imagine that it is 10 times more for non-EU suppliers that do not even have the resources to understand all these political shifting circumstances. So at this point, you can create this layer of trust with your suppliers, and you can be the one that collaborates with them and makes it so that you together make sense out of this. And I would definitely urge you to not position the EUDR discussions as part of the EUDR, because at this point, EUDR has this stigma of being something that has created a little bit of pain, but make it part of a broader journey towards either responsible sourcing or legality or sustainability, whatever works best for the messaging you already have with your suppliers. In this way, with this strategy, you can establish strong trust-based relationships with your suppliers, which will not only help you for EUDR, but they will also create a more transparent supply chain in the long term. Now, before we move on to the last section of our slides, I have one poll for you. Let me launch it, which is, now that you know what's the fundamental, what is something that you can work on, how do you think about the following? If this delay happens, what will be your next steps? Are you going to build the core processes now? Is your company just going to start from early 2026 discussing again? Or you're going to take the approach of picking it up next Q3? So I do see your responses already. And we see that the vast majority says that they will keep building the core processes of EUDR now, which is honestly very hopeful. And I really think it's the smartest decision to make, considering how we saw the postponement playing out for companies last year. So we have 72% on this, and also a 16% slowly starting to discussing again in 2026, and 11% picking it up again Q3 of 2026. Thank you very much for your answers. So now we will move on to the last section of our webinar for today, which is that everybody these last few weeks have had discussions on how should we move on now? How should we consider the budgeting discussions? And we picked up 4 main questions that we see are recurring, and we're giving you our take on them. So the first question is, and maybe most popular, is if EUDR is postponed, why spend money now? And shouldn't we wait for clarity? So it's important to mention in these discussions that postponement doesn't change the timing. It changes the timing, but doesn't change the direction. So the regulation is delayed, but not cancelled. And this means that your responsibilities essentially might not change. So we also saw from the first postponement that it showed a very clear pattern that despite gaining this extra year, most of the companies still found themselves rushing through the last months before implementation. So you should use this time in a more strategic way than last time. So potentially to invest in people, systems, or anything that will make your company ready. Now, the second question we see coming up again and again is, if we move on, yes, what if the rules change again? So won't our work go to waste? So the framework is already in force. So we do not expect the Commission to just scrap the whole document and create a new one. That's why we said that origins and risk assessments most probably will remain as key elements there. We also know, and it's very important to keep in mind these days, that regulatory changes seem to be extremely last minute and very reactive, which means that if you wait for the final signing of the EU, you most probably will have very, very little space left for you to prepare until the next step. So instead, what we propose is adopt a phased investment approach where you start with a core and reusable building blocks so that you don't waste your money or effort, and then expand to the nuances of the regulations once the guidance is done. Now, then the third question is, okay, and what is the return on investment for investing with EUDR core now? Of course, we have compliance, and we have seen that compliance in the last minute will drive higher costs. Most probably, you will have to make some rash decisions, which might increase your costs, or you could even end up with no compliance when the deadline approaches. But secondly, we also mentioned that you can really benefit from EUDR due diligence to a general risk management approach, where you can feed all the risk data that you're going to get into your sustainability reporting, sourcing decisions, and more. And lastly, we mentioned traceability and how it can enhance brand credibility, investor confidence, and in general contribute to a long-term value for your supply chain beyond the regulatory pressure. And then the last question is, isn't it tricky to build systems before the IT system is live? And the short answer is no, because the IT system will be just a submission form tool and not a due diligence tool. It will only record a snapshot of your order and give you a reference number, but the actual data collection, risk assessment, validations, and everything must occur internally. And if still there are concerns, also the Commission has already published detailed descriptions of what data will be there, so you can already get an idea of what you should expect. But as the EU builds their systems, the companies are supposed to build their own internal systems as well. That, I think, concludes our questions on uncertainties, and I think we can move on with the Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks, Elisabeth. Hopefully, kind of our talk combined gives you a good indication of the political background that you can also take into your company and discuss, okay, what do we expect going forward? And also combines the conversation with, okay, but what are the tangible things that you can do today? So we hope that gave you a good indication. On top of that, of course, we've seen some really interesting questions coming in. I've seen two questions that I quickly want to address about the slides. So we'll automatically send the recording over to you after the webinar ends. So you can expect that in your inbox within 5 to 10 minutes after the webinar ends. If you do want the slides specifically, as I also saw someone mention that they want to share the slides internally, you can send us an email at eudr@coolsat.com and we'll be happy to share with you. But also, you can also email us at jasper@coolsat.com or elisabeth@coolsat.com, and we'll be happy to get the slides to you. Also, of course, any other questions that may not be addressed today, feel free to email us. Question here from Lotte. Let me put it on the screen. Why is there no scenario considered where just the simplification is applied, such as, for example, no risk category only? Really good question. This is also something that we had considered to include, but looking at kind of the current, the reality of what we're seeing that the delays on the table, we only have 3 months. The EPP also kind of spoke very much in favor of the delay. And well, if you look at the current climate in Brussels, or if you look at the European Parliament, EPP has a lot of power, and they generally kind of give a foreboding of what's to come. And now the agricultural ministers are also on board for a delay. I think that if they were to move forward without a delay, that would be very short notice. Plus, if you say we're going to have a no-risk category but no delay, that means that they have to set that whole thing up before the end of the year. And that whole thing here implies that they would have to look at, okay, what is a no-risk category from a regulatory perspective? Which countries would apply? And then what would the due diligence process be under a changed regulation, essentially. So I think they will require more time, but that's not to say that it can't happen. Of course, at this point, anything is possible. So it could happen that this is also a scenario. So thank you very much for raising it. Question here from Rikin. I think a good question for Elisabeth. Can people outside of Europe also work with companies in Europe to help make sure that they meet the requirements for EUDR? I've created a table using AI, but I have no clue if Americans can work along with certain European companies and making sure that they meet compliance of EUDR.
Yeah, I would say that that's definitely the spirit of collaborating between suppliers and customers potentially inside the EU. If I was the outside of the EU company, I would already try to understand what would be the requirements from an EU company and already start preparing on this. So honestly, all the information that we explained as the first response exercises are something that the non-EU company can do today and have already ready, because when the EU company will come with the requirements, you will already have them ready to be shared with them. If you already have any, if I'm not sure if you are inside or outside the EU, but whoever you are, it's very good to already contact the person on the other side and start this process for sure.
Perfect. Also looking at the time, for those that have been at our previous webinars, you'll know that we are notoriously known for running over, but that's also because we want to answer as many questions as possible. So we'll answer 2 more questions. One question here from Aniko. Do you think the following scenario could be a viable option, having no delay in implementation, but also not applying any sanctions in 2026 if a product is not yet deforestation free? Well, very similar answer to what I gave before, except for here that we might consider no sanctions yet or no application of the enforcement. I think it is indeed an option that we could consider. I think it's a bit less realistic than the delay option, but of course, nothing should be off the table at this point. As the European Commission might throw a curveball when they actually come forward with their proposal. I got a bit more of a technical question here from Janka. So a good question for Elisabeth, our technical expert. If company A is buying the EUDR relevant product rubber from upstream operator B, where DDS already is submitted, and assembles it in the non-EUDR relevant product, in this case a car, then selling the car on the market, is the company A the operator or the trader? And what are the obligations of company A?
Yeah, so essentially, the company A has no EUDR obligations. The way I try to always look at it is from inbound and outbound perspective. Inbound perspective, you already have both the EUDR covered materials with the due diligence statement, so you have no obligations of your own, and your obligations then lie on the outbound. However, a car is not part of the Annex 1 list, so essentially you don't have to declare anything for the cars that you produce. If you were buying the materials, the rubber material from outside of the EU and there was no due diligence statement, that's where you would be an operator importing the raw materials. And then again, when you were creating the car, you would have no responsibilities for the car.
Perfect. Well, with just 4 minutes over time, I think we're going to end today's session. Thanks everyone for your attendance. Once again, thanks also to those that asked some really interesting questions. We hope to see you again at our next webinar, and you know where to reach us, either eudr@coolstad.com or jasper@coolstad.com or elisabeth@coolstad.com. We're happy to answer any and all questions. But for now, thanks very much for attending, and we hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye, everyone.